The dust hung in the air like a held breath. She stood on the porch of her ranch house, her hand gripping the wooden railing so hard her knuckles had turned white. 10 years. 10 years of waiting, of working the land alone, of sleeping in a bed that held only her weight. 10 years of wondering if he was dead or if he'd simply chosen to stay gone. And now he was here. The man who rode up to her gate was the same height as her husband, the same build. The horse was his horse, the one he'd ridden out on a decade ago, looking for work, looking for fortune, looking for something she couldn't give him in their small corner of the frontier. But he wasn't alone. A woman rode beside him, young, beautiful, with her hand rested on his arm in a way that spoke of intimacy, of secrets, of a world that existed between them that had nothing to do with the woman waiting on the porch. Time stopped. The frontier noise, the wind, the cattle, the creaking fences, all of it faded away. There was only the sound of hoofbeats slowing as they approached, only the weight of 10 years pressing down on her chest like a stone. He looked at her. His eyes held something like shame, something like longing, something like a man who'd been carrying an impossible choice for 1,000 miles. "Sarah," he said, just her name, like it was both a greeting and an apology. The woman beside him didn't say anything. She just watched. And in that moment, everything Sarah had built in those 10 years of waiting began to crack. But before this moment shattered their world entirely, let me take you back to where it all began. Sarah's life was a frontier prayer answered and then forgotten. She woke before dawn and moved through her ranch with the rhythm of someone who'd learned to be both man and woman to the land. She mended fences, she managed the cattle, she kept the house. She built something real with her own hands while her husband was away building something for both of them. That was the bargain they'd made 10 years ago. Marcus wanted to seek his fortune in the gold country 2 territories over, just for a few years, he'd said, just long enough to strike it rich, and then they could expand the ranch, build a bigger house, have the life they'd both dreamed about. Sarah had believed him. Love had made her believe him. Hope had made her believe him. So she'd kissed him goodbye one cold morning, and he'd ridden away. The first year, his letters came regularly, letters about the hardship of the mining camps, about how close he was to finding the strike that would change everything, letters that spoke of missing her, wanting her, needing just a little more time. By year 5, the letters came less frequently. By year 7, they'd stopped altogether. Sarah told herself he was too busy, too deep in the mountains, too caught up in the work. She told herself that silence wasn't abandonment, it was just the frontier taking everything, even words. But in the quiet hours of the morning when she was alone with her work and her thoughts, she knew something else. She knew that he wasn't coming back the way he'd left. She knew that the man who rode away at 30 years old was not the same man, if he returned at all, who'd ride back. Still, she waited. She waited because waiting was what a wife did. She waited because the law said she was married, and the Bible said marriage was forever, and the frontier said that a woman alone was a woman vulnerable. So she built the ranch into something real. She became a woman of the land. She became someone strong enough to survive 10 years of waiting. Then one morning, the dust rose on the road leading to her property, and she knew before she even saw him clearly that her waiting was over. Her husband had returned. The question that broke her heart was whether he'd returned alone. He introduced the woman as Miss Eleanor. That was the first lie, a small one, but a lie nonetheless. The way he said it, with careful distance, with formality, told Sarah everything. Miss Eleanor, not a friend, not a companion. Miss Eleanor, like she was a stranger he'd picked up on the road. But she wasn't a stranger. Sarah could see that in the way Eleanor looked at her. A look that held pity and something harder underneath. A look that said, I know what you are to him and I know what I am to him, and we both know they're not the same thing. Over the first evening, the strangeness grew like a winter shadow. Marcus kept his distance from Sarah. He didn't hold her hand. He didn't touch her face. When she moved close to him, he found reasons to step away, reaching for his saddlebag, checking on the horses, anything to maintain the careful distance between them. Eleanor, on the other hand, moved through the house like she'd been there before. She knew where the coffee was kept. She knew the layout of the kitchen. She settled into the chair by the fire with an ease that suggested she wasn't a stranger to this place or to this man. Sarah watched. Half-truths began to surface. When Sarah asked how they'd met, Marcus gave an answer that was technically accurate, but hollow. They'd met on the trail, traveling the same direction. Eleanor had been heading this way anyway, seemed practical to travel together. Sarah wanted to believe him. The desperate part of her wanted to believe that this was coincidence, not conspiracy. That Eleanor's beauty, Eleanor's familiarity, Eleanor's claim on him was just something that had developed on the road, not something that had been simmering for years. But doubt had found its way into Sarah's chest, and once doubt takes hold, it grows like a weed in deep soil. That night, Sarah lay in the bed she'd slept in alone for 10 years, and she heard Eleanor moving in the guest room down the hall. Heard her voice, low and familiar, speaking to Marcus in tones that carried more intimacy than a stranger should possess. Sarah realized she was trembling. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with the story her husband was telling. And she was terrified of what the truth might be.
The next morning, Sarah went to town. She didn't tell Marcus where she was going. She just saddled a horse and rode toward the settlement, toward the people who might know things, the general storekeeper, the doctor, the people who collected stories the way the frontier collects dust. What she learned broke something in her that she didn't know was still holdable. Marcus had been in the gold country, yes, but he'd struck it rich 5 years ago. 5 years! And then he'd disappeared from the mining camps, gone north with woman, gone to build a homestead with a woman, gone to live a different life with a different wife, all while Sarah waited on this ranch, believing he was still working, still seeking, still coming home. The town doctor had seen them together 3 years ago, passing through. He said Eleanor was heavy with child, Marcus's child from the looks of him. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. He had built a life. Not with her, with someone else. While she waited, while she held on to a promise that had rotted from the inside long ago. She rode back to the ranch in silence, her mind racing with 1,000 questions, 1,000 ways this story could end. When she arrived, Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line. Casual, domestic, like she belonged there, like she'd always belonged there. Marcus was working on the fence that Sarah had been maintaining alone for 10 years. Sarah walked up to him, and her voice came out steady, though her world was falling apart. "Eleanor's pregnant, isn't she?" Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Marcus stopped. His hands went still on the fence post. "Was," he said quietly, "she was pregnant. We have a son. He's 6 years old. His name is James." The words hit Sarah like bullets. A son, a child, a whole life he'd built without her, without ever telling her, without ever giving her the choice to know the truth. Eleanor stepped back from the laundry line and watched them, not interfering, just watching, like she was waiting for something to break. And Sarah realized what was happening. This wasn't a man returning to an old life. This was a man bringing a new life into the presence of an old one, forcing a collision that had nowhere to go. "Why are you here?" Sarah whispered. "Why did you come back?" Marcus looked at her, and she could see the years on his face. 10 years of wait. 10 years of carrying a secret that was too big to hold alone. "Because I have to make a choice. And I couldn't make it without facing what I was choosing to leave behind." That night, the truth came out like a wound opening. Marcus told Sarah everything. About meeting Eleanor in the mining camps. About how she'd come looking for her brother and found him instead. About how they'd fallen in love in the way that people fall in love when they're far from home and need someone to make the distance bearable. About the child. About the homestead they'd built north of the mountains, where they'd been trying to live a quiet life, a true life, a life that wasn't built on a lie. But 3 weeks ago, Eleanor's parents had come. Wealthy people from the East, people with power and lawyers and the ability to make demands. They'd told Eleanor that she'd abandoned her family for an unsuitable man. They wanted the child. They wanted Eleanor back to civilization. They were threatening to take the boy by force if Eleanor didn't return voluntarily. Marcus realized that running wasn't going to work anymore. That sooner or later the life they'd built was going to crumble under pressure. And that before it did, he had to come back here. He had to face Sarah. He had to answer for the choice he'd made a decade ago to stay gone instead of coming back and telling the truth. "I was a coward," Marcus said. His voice was hollow. "I stayed away because it was easier than admitting I'd chosen someone else. I built a new life instead of facing the old one. And now that new life has fallen apart, and I'm here asking the woman I promised everything to for forgiveness I don't deserve." Sarah sat in the darkness of her own house, the house she'd kept for a ghost of a husband, and felt something shift inside her. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding. He had come back not with hope of reconciliation, but with the weight of impossible choices. And Eleanor had come because she loved him, and because she was terrified of losing their son. "What are you asking me for?" Sarah asked quietly. "Permission," Marcus said, "to live, to choose her, to be honest about what I am instead of pretending I'm someone I'm not, to be a father to my son instead of a ghost in 2 different lives." Eleanor spoke then, for the first time in her presence, and her voice was steady. "I came here to face you, because Marcus needed to face you. He's been torn in half between what he promised you and what he built with me, and that's no way to live. That's no way to be a husband or a father or a man. He needed to come here and choose, knowing full well what he was choosing to lose." Sarah looked at them both, at the man she'd married a lifetime ago, now a stranger, at the woman who held his heart, now standing in Sarah's kitchen like a sister made of sharp edges. And she realized what the frontier had taught her in 10 years of solitude. She realized that some loves don't survive distance. Some promises get broken by time itself. And some women have to learn to survive alone, not because they're strong, but because strength is what the frontier demands.
Before they left, Marcus sat with Sarah alone. He told her the thing he'd been too afraid to say until that moment. "I stopped loving you," he said quietly. "Not all at once, Not with a moment I can point to, but slowly, over the years, the distance between us became an ocean, and I learned to swim it without you. And then I learned I didn't want to swim it back. It should have destroyed her. A decade ago, those words would have been fatal. But Sarah had spent 10 years becoming someone Marcus had never known. She'd learned her own strength. She'd learned that a woman's worth wasn't measured by the promises a man made at an altar. She'd learned that survival was a form of love, too. Not for him, but for herself. "I forgive you," Sarah said, and she meant it. "Not because what you did was right, but because I forgive myself for waiting so long for something that was never coming back." Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching this moment between Sarah and Marcus. A moment of understanding, a moment of goodbye. "What will you do?" Eleanor asked Sarah. Sarah looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman just as trapped with love as she had been. Trapped between her heart and her son and a future that kept demanding impossible choices. "I'm going to sell this ranch," Sarah said. 10 years is a long time to wait for ghosts. I'm going to go north, maybe to the city. I'm going to build a life that belongs to me, not to a marriage that ended the day he rode away and chose to stay gone. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Tears of relief, tears of understanding, tears of a woman recognizing another woman's liberation. Marcus reached out to Sarah, but she stepped back, not with anger, just with the gentle firmness of someone drawing a necessary line. "You gave me 10 years, Sarah said. "Now I'm going to give myself the rest of my life." By spring, the ranch had changed hands. The new owner was a young couple from back east, people with money and hope and the belief that the frontier could give them what they wanted. Sarah rode out early one morning, before they arrived, to say goodbye to the land she'd bled into for a decade. She walked the fences, she stood by the house, she let herself feel the weight of all those years. The waiting, the hoping, the slow realization that she'd been grieving a man who was still alive. A letter had come from the north. Eleanor had written it. She told Sarah that Marcus was working as a foreman on a cattle operation, that their son James was learning to ride, that they'd finally found something like peace. She asked Sarah's forgiveness for the pain they'd caused her. Sarah forgave her. But more importantly, Sarah forgave herself for loving a man who couldn't love her back, for waiting for a ghost when she could have been building a life, for believing that a woman's value was measured by the fidelity of a man instead of her own resilience. The frontier had taught her that lesson in solitude, and now she was free. On a clear morning, she left the ranch riding south instead of following the road back to town. She'd heard about opportunities for women in the cities, work, independence, a life lived on her own terms. She didn't know what she'd find, but she knew she'd find it as herself, not as someone waiting for someone else to validate her existence. The frontier doesn't give easy lessons, but it gives true ones. And Sarah had finally learned the greatest truth of all. A woman alone is not a woman abandoned. She is a woman who's chosen herself. Thank you for listening to this tale here on Frontier Love Tools. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the courage it takes to let go, to forgive, to choose yourself when the frontier demands sacrifice, then don't write off just yet. There are more stories waiting beneath the western sign. Stories about women who learned their own strength in the silence.
Stories about men who face the weight of their choices. Stories about the impossible decisions that shape a land and the people who inhabit it. Make sure you subscribe to Frontier Love Tools, because out here, every sunset hides another story waiting to be told. Stories about love that lasts. Stories about love that breaks. And stories about something even more important. The love we have to give ourselves when the frontier takes everything else away. Because that's the real frontier, friend. Not the land, not the dust. The frontier is inside the human heart, where we learn what we're willing to lose and what we refuse to become. Subscribe now, and I'll see you next sunset.